From Cambridge Community Television. The images on your screen are from the Mediterranean. They are pictures of individuals fleeing from war-torn countries: Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, countries in which war has destroyed, at least partially, the possibility of living in their country of origin. These images could be repeated thousands of times. They show the crisis of humanity, repeated time and time again. Individuals with no place to go, struggling to find the possibility of escape and perhaps a new life. The picture here is the capsizing of one of those boats. What is not shown is the horrors of other passengers not on the top deck. We will be reading from a book called The New Odyssey by Patrick Kingsley. It describes the horrors of individuals trying to escape their homeland with any means possible. Usually, the means possible are on ships of this kind, completely overbooked. What is not shown is perhaps the decks below, the ones on which these individuals are standing. Those areas will be packed as well by individuals lying pressed to fill every hole, every square inch of that boat. This is the horrors also when a boat sinks, individuals cast into the Mediterranean. In night, they cannot be seen. These are images of dead washed ashore. From the book, The New Odyssey, referring to Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Dozens of Eritrean exiles meet to describe the totalitarian state where many citizens fear arrest at any moment and dare not speak to their neighbors. Gather in groups or linger long outside their home. Eritrea is not at war, but its first and only president, Afwerki, plays up to the possibility of a return to the conflict with neighboring Ethiopia, which ruled the country until early 1990s. Bodies on the shores. These are images of individuals trying to undertake these voyages, captured by photographers, image after image. The threat is used to justify the absence of a constitution, the destruction of the judicial system, and the implementation of indefinite national service that allows the government to treat each civilian as a modern-day slave for the duration of his or her life. This indefinite national service is the defining feature of the contemporary Eritrea, and the most obvious reason for its exodus. Through this system, the government controls almost every aspect of civilians' life, male or female, and from the age of 16 or 17. Where you live, your daily routine, and how often you see your family, all this is decided by the government thanks to the national service system. These are pictures of individuals caught in this crisis of trying to escape countries like Eritrea, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. The crisis is unending. There is no definite study of the militia involvement, the military militia involvement in the trafficking of individuals. There is no definite study of the militia's involvement. Some of them actively police the trade, perhaps hoping to curry favor with the international community. But my research, that's Patrick Kingsley speaking, and that of colleagues suggests that other militias are doing the opposite. For some of them, it's largely a passive role. In exchange for allowing a smuggler to operate on their territory, a militia leader might demand a cut of his profit. A smuggler told me that the fraction that controls Libya's eastern border with Egypt allows migrants to cross for a fee, and the same happens on the Egyptian side. On the coast, smugglers say they bribe the groups that control the ports. Sometimes the militia involvement seems more proactive. Migrants I've interviewed with in Italy say their trips were organized by a leader of one militia in the northwest of Libya, and they gave me his name. Others described the process whereby they were arrested by the militia that run some of the Libya's migrant detention centers, and then detained within these camps. Those who could quickly come up with the cash were allowed to buy their freedom. Those who couldn't were sold to different militias in other parts of the country, transferred to their detention camps, and then finally sold to smugglers. The smugglers would then get their money back through the migrants' families or fellow countrymen, who would be told to scramble together another ransom. The foreign labor in Libya. It's worth lingering slightly longer with this particular point. In Europe, it is often argued that the majority of migrants from Libya are economic migrants and therefore unworthy of sanctuary. In the case of Eritreans, this is demonstrably false. In the case of West Africans, this is also arguably wrong. But it takes a richer understanding of Libyan life to make this argument. It is nevertheless an obvious point once you consider the miserable existence of the foreigner in Libya. These are pictures of refugees escaping their homeland. The vast majority receive nothing like the level of service. They're speaking about Eritrea and the horrors of national service in that nation. In reference to the cost that these refugees have to pay to their smugglers, on page 76, there's a reckoning of this amount. That's because the profits on offer are so exorbitant. An informant tells us they are evasive when I ask them to tote up their earnings, but even without their help, it's easy to work out the ballpark total. As a conservative estimate, the Zodiac is a kind of boat with 100 passengers who each pay $1,000 to create a turnover of $100,000. Subtract the cost of the boat itself, the engine, the cost of keeping the migrants alive in the warehouse for a fortnight, and you'll still be left with around $80,000 or 52,000 pounds. Even if half of that went towards keeping the local militia happy, the smuggler gang would then have at least 26,000 pounds to share among themselves. From just 1 week's work, a wooden boat would reap even more. These are life jackets strewn on the coast where the refugees came ashore. Interesting in all of this is Chris Hedges, who gives an accounting of the final stages of capitalism and how smuggling of this kind is seen to be a method of earning money. The final stages of capitalism, Hedges says, will be marked by global capital being unable to expend and generate profits at formal levels. Capitalists would begin to consume the government along with the physical, social structures that sustain them. Democracy, social welfare, electoral participation, and the common good. Investment in public transportation, roads, bridges, political parties, industry, educational, healthcare, and the protection of the ecosystem would be sacrificed to feed the mania of short-term profits. These assaults would destroy the host and is the last stage of late capitalism that Donald Trump represents. Trump and his reactionary party of capitalists who have seized 34 of 50 governors and 68 of 99 state legislatures, 49 of which are bicameral, planned to oversee the final campaign of corporate pillaging of America and the rest of the planet. It will be crass and brazen as those of the desperate people in the face of dead-end jobs and ruinous personal debt, who patronize Trump casinos and the casinos springing up across America. These, of course, are not casinos, are not pictures of casinos in America. These are pictures of the desperation of individuals fleeing their country, their home country, which has been pillaged by war or dictatorships. The war and dictatorships which come about through the manipulation This is a picture of one of the sinking boats. You can see it listing shortly before it capsizes. Many of those on this boat cannot swim, and anyone without a life jacket is doomed. It's possible that the flooded compartments below the waterline are filled with individuals who have already drowned. The crisis is one that creates desperation to the extent that individuals are willing to try any method to escape from their war-torn country. In the face of the horrors of facing smugglers, who charge any price and use any kind of weapon to intimidate those interested in fleeing the country of their origin. Death, as the author Patrick Kingsley states in The New Odyssey, is never more than just a few minutes from these refugees when they enter the boats. He speaks on page 88, in Egypt, their operations are smaller in scale than in Libya, but no one knows exactly how many of these migrants who arrive in Italy. No one knows how many of these migrants who arrive in Italy but we know that the Italian Coast Guard, that 62 boats reached Italy from Egypt in 2014. Each of those ships would have carried between 300 and 500 people, meaning the Egyptian-based smugglers were responsible for somewhere between 20 and 30,000 migrants that year, or around 15%. The exorbitant profits that these smugglers make the main nationalities arriving in Greece, you can see here, Syria in 2015, 450,000, in Afghanistan 200,000, in Iraq about 100,000, Pakistan and Iran are also there. Some of these are pictures of refugee camps. This is again the picture of refugees fleeing across the Mediterranean. These are pictures of children. Refugees. These pictures are taken in reference to their efforts, their parents' efforts to have them leave their war-torn country to find a way to get to Europe. The number of refugees here, 1.8 million, 720,000 from Lebanon, 520,000 from Jordan, 464,000 from Turkey, 172,000 in Iraq, and 11,000 in Egypt. It's a mistake. Those are refugees in that country, 720,000 in Lebanon. Although Lebanon is by far the smallest of all of those countries, it has the most refugees. 1 million Syrian children refugees, 740,000 under the age of 11, 425 million internationally displaced people. This is one of the refugee camps. Apparently in winter. These are children who are refugees from their nations of origin. Not only are these children and their parents forced on ships which are dangerous toward flooding and capsizing, but they are also told to change ships in mid-ocean. And the reason for that is, in case the ship that they are on is more valuable than one that may be taken into custody by the Italian or Spanish Navy patrolling the European coastline, the refugees would be forced to change ships in mid-ocean. They are also subject to any demand that the smugglers would make. In one case, they are simply ferried back and forth across the Mediterranean until a better time to transport them towards a destination is found. Yet as the sun begins to dip, this is a quote again on page 110, there's yet another change of boats. The smugglers know they'll lose the ship that arrives in Italy, so they want to use a ship that they can afford to lose, something that's a bit older or a bit slower. No passenger is happy about this, but there's no point complaining. Last year's shipwreck, the one that Hassan narrowly avoided, reportedly happened after the migrants refused to change ships. The smugglers then rammed two boats together to try to force the passengers of one to board the other. The first boat capsized. Several hundred passengers lost their lives and drowned. One such report of an incident like this took place on page 119 of the book, The Odyssey, the New Odyssey. But instead there is a crash, then a silence. Then seconds later, another crash. Finally the boat starts to heel on its side, trapped in the cabin below, decks 17 miles from the Libyan coast. Ibrahim Mabalo and hundreds of others begin to sink below the surface of the sea. The salt water gushes in. The cabin becomes a huge water tank filled with drenched, gasping men who flail and lunge as they can. Ibrahim, a 20-year-old Gambian laborer who can swim, but most of the others can't. One grasps at Ibrahim's gripping his trousers, pulling him towards the bottom of the cabin. Other survivors I met were both abused by their Libyan employers. One was kidnapped by his and held for ransom, which he couldn't pay. The other simply went unpaid for months on end. Ibrahim, though was lucky. He found work with a man who paid him a daily wage and treated him with relative respect. But even then, Ibrahim found Libya a nightmare. It's a country in the throes of civil war. So after a few months, he told his boss he wanted to leave. He would have returned home if he could, but having experienced the trauma of the desert journey, once on his way up, Ibrahim wasn't keen to try it again. If you're going to Gambia before the smugglers will take you in the desert and throw you out there to die, Ibrahim said, it's why a lot of people won't go back. They won't go back because of the treatment they get at smugglers, and yet these pictures are taken by individuals who have risked everything in order to get away from the country of their origin, their homeland, in simply an effort to try to begin a new life. Another report on page 141 in the New Odyssey by Kingsley. But in a rescue like this, the report is about a ship trying to approach one of these vessels with immigrants aboard. And it says, as the Argos glides to a halt alongside the refugees, shielding the smaller boats from the waves, the crew can see that the Eritreans are using a bucket to bail out the hold. How long the boat will last is unclear. The passengers packed inside the hold are also of concern. A lack of ventilation, coupled with the fumes of the engine, often suffocates people trapped. Over 50 died last month. And there's the possibility of panic. By this point, another rescue passengers have also been known to try to sink their own boat to make sure their saviors don't give up on them. Last week, Amali explains 600 refugees ignored the instructions to leave a boat one by one, instead piled onto the Argos in any way that they could. Another report. When you first draw alongside a boat like this, nothing quite compares or prepares you for the shock. The witness says, I've witnessed a smaller rescue. I've seen hundreds of photos of this kind of boat before, and I've just witnessed a smaller rescue. But a boat of 650 refugees crammed into every last plank on the deck and into every last space in the hold is an overwhelming sight. Moreover, many photos you've previously looked at do not tell the true story. I realize that pictures never quite convey the epic scale of the situation. This swaying boat set against the vastness of the sea and its surroundings, this knot of lives, only ever a few moments from death. These are pictures of the parliament debating what to do about the continuing crisis in the Mediterranean. But these pictures are not any different, although they are of the European Union. These individuals here are debating how 27 different nations can come to an agreement about how to solve the international crisis. But these individuals pictured here are not responsible for the crisis. They're not responsible for the crisis because the responsibility for the crisis lies at the hands of those who have created the war situations which led to the refugee crisis. The war situation is the situation created by the United States in its attack against Iraq in 2003 and in 2005, and its attack against Afghanistan in 2003. The crisis unleashed one war situation after another. It was the era of George Bush and the crisis that he maintains America was in being under attack by the Muslim nations. The crisis, however, as history did determine, that Iraq was in no way responsible for the 9/11 debacle. The attack on the World Trade Centers was ostensibly engineered by Osama bin Laden, but that has never been proven. It is maintained, and the reason that this was maintained led to the creation of Guantanamo Bay and the extrajudiciary situation in which prisoners captured on the battlefield could be declared too dangerous to bring to court in the United States, and therefore incarcerated indefinitely without trial in Guantanamo. 2 weeks ago, we had experts here on our show giving a clear explanation about that crisis. The reality of the situation is that the United States and its war structure is responsible for the unending crises in those nations, Libya, for instance, but also the crisis in civil war areas, and the crisis developing in Turkey as well, with the potential of a dictatorship. To explain basically how the crisis has developed and the consequences of the crisis which has led to the election of Donald Trump, we turn now to an address provided by Chris Hedges. Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize winning author, a correspondent from war zones, and a pastor who has studied at Harvard Divinity School. His explanation of the crisis which we are entering in now is given in a YouTube presentation which we will show. We thank Hedges and the possibility of showing this on our What We Should Know broadcast this afternoon. Here's the address of Chris Hedges.
The final stages of capitalism, Karl Marx predicted, would be marked by global capital being unable to expand and generate profits at former levels. Capitalists would begin to consume the government, along with the physical and social structures that sustain them. Democracy, social welfare, electoral participation, the common good, investment in public transportation, roads, bridges, utilities, industry, education, healthcare, and the protection of the ecosystem would be sacrificed to feed the mania for short-term profit. These assaults would destroy the host. And this is the stage of late capitalism that Donald Trump represents. Trump and his reactionary capitalists who have seized 34 of 50 governorships and 68 of 99 state legislatures, 49 of which are bicameral, plan to oversee the final campaign of corporate pillaging of America and the rest of the planet. It will be crass and brazen, as crass and brazen as the fleecing of the desperate people hoping for a miracle in the face of dead-end jobs and ruinous personal debt who patronized Trump's casinos and the casinos springing up across the United States and Canada, or who shelled out thousands of dollars for the sham of Trump University. He is unleashing a kleptocracy. The word comes from the Greek, klepto meaning thieves, and kratos meaning rule, so it is literally rule by thieves. One that will rival the kleptocracies carried out by Suharto in Indonesia and Marcos in the Philippines. It is not that Trump and his family will use the influence of government to increase their wealth, although this will certainly take place on a massive scale. It is that hundreds of billions of federal dollars will be diverted into the hands of cronies, sleazy bankers, unethical financial firms, and scabrous hedge fund managers. Everything will, to use a business term, be harvested. The decaying pillars of the liberal state in America will be obliterated. At the same time, the militarization of America is being accelerated. The defense budget will be increased by 10%, or $54 billion, although the United States already spends more than the defense budgets of the next 7 countries combined. The paramilitary forces of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which will soon hire 10,000 more agents, and the Border Patrol, which will hire 5,000 more agents, along with Homeland Security, have all deputized local and state police to function as their auxiliaries. They will be flooded with cast-off military-issue equipment. These paramilitary forces will not disband once they have finished terrorizing and deporting some of the 11 million undocumented workers in the United States. They will turn on their next victims, Muslims, African Americans, Asians, dissidents. This militarization of society is designed to carry out the race war that Trump and those around him see as inevitable at home and abroad. In poor communities of color, this race war has already begun. Racial profiling, random police stops, raids at homes and businesses, people of color pulled from vehicles at checkpoints, seizures of individuals with no criminal records or who never committed a serious crime, imprisonment without trial, expedited deportation hearings and removal proceedings that violate the most basic human rights. The arrest of a beneficiary of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, Daniel Ramirez Medina, 23, who along with the program's other 750,000 successful applicants had revealed all personal history to the government in applying for DACA status. Parents separated, perhaps forever, from their children. The hunted going underground. The end of the rule of law. The abandonment of the common good. The obliteration of a social state in which institutions and assistance programs, from public education to social security and welfare, make justice, equality, and dignity possible. White Europeans who are undocumented are not being targeted. The executive orders of Trump are directed against people of color. They begin from the premise that white Americans are the true victims of neoliberalism, deindustrialization, and falling living standards. The Trump orders are written not to make America great again, but to make America white. They are an updated version of the Nazis' Nuremberg laws, the Jim Crow laws, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the Naturalization Act of 1870.
This critique from Chris Hedges is this author's opinion is monumental. It is not one of the humorous attacks against Donald Trump, but rather a scathing critique on the realities of Donald Trump and his cronies as they initiate the final plundering of American society. The critique by Hedges, brilliantly structured as though it were a passage from a text building the basis for the analysis of that text and the conclusions that we can draw morally and ethically from that text. The reality that Hedges cites is not only categorized at the beginning by his mentioning Marx, Karl Marx, and Marx's correct analysis that the final stages of capitalism before its collapse would be the plundering of the state plundering of the state by the capitalist class because of their inability the inability of invested capital to make a desired return on profits. Thus, the state, the host, the state itself would be pillaged by the capitalists. The class of capitalists organized by Trump is clearly one that shows a complete lack of moral or professional qualification as a public servant, but more as a, to use the words of Chris Hedges, a scabrous hedge fund manager. We'll continue this critique by Hedges.
They are intended to institutionalize an overt racial hierarchy in the United States, one already far advanced in the miniature police states where people of color live in marginal communities. In these impoverished enclaves, there is no right to trial or due process. Militarized police kill with impunity, and the courts lock people away, often for life. Rights are treated as privileges that can instantly be revoked. The poor, especially poor people of color, are exempted from moral consideration. They are attacked as impediments to social cohesion. And these impediments must be eliminated. Jews, their community centers enduring threats of violence, and their graveyards desecrated, will also be persecuted. American fascism is rapidly being cemented into place by uniformed and heavily armed paramilitary goons, clutching the flag and the cross, and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance and the Lord's Prayer. Little or no prospect of rescue from individual indolence or impotence can be expected to arrive from a political state that is not and refuses to be a social state. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman wrote, "Without social rights for all, a large and all probability growing number of people will find their political rights of little use and unworthy of their attention. If political rights are necessary to set social rights in place, social rights are indispensable to make political rights real and keep them in operation. The two rights need each other for their survival. That survival can only be their joint achievement." Presidential Chief Strategist Stephen Bannon, in his public comments and his films, such as Generation Zero, has embraced a historical determinism worthy of Karl Marx. He posits that Western culture has been contaminated and is being destroyed by darker races and barbaric religions and belief systems. His conspiratorial view of history and society sees a global war between the white race and the lesser breeds of the earth as not only inevitable, but one that will reinvigorate and purify America. This idea of regeneration through violence, which has always been part of the American myth, is also a central tenet of fascism. Racists and conspiracy theorists such as Bannon, Michael Anton, Stephen Miller, Sebastian Gorka constitute Trump's ideological brain trust. Gorka goes so far as to argue that the failure to understand the evil of radical Islam stems from a systematic subversion of the national security establishment under the banner of inclusivity, cultural awareness, and political correctness. In a 2014 speech, Bannon said, "I believe we've come partly off track in the years since the fall of the Soviet Union, and we're starting now in the 21st century, which I believe strongly is a crisis both of our church, a crisis of our faith, a crisis of the West, a crisis of capitalism." There is a major war brewing that's already global. Bannon said it's going global in scale. And today's technology, today's media, today's access to weapons of mass destruction, it's going to lead to a global conflict, and I believe has to be confronted today. Every day that we refuse to look at this as what it is and the scale of it, and really the viciousness of it, will be a day where you will rue that we didn't act. Bannon is a proponent of the theory popularized by authors William Strauss and Neil Howe in their books Generations, The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069, and The Fourth Turning, an American prophecy, what the cycles of history tell us about America's next rendezvous with destiny. These authors argue that roughly every 80 years, or an average human lifespan, the country goes through a cataclysmic crisis. This crisis triggers war, industrial slaughter, and genocide, and lasts for a decade or more. In its aftermath, they argue the social order is rejuvenated. Strauss and Howe highlight the American Revolution of 1775 to 1783, the Civil War, the Great Depression, and World War II as examples of how this cycle works. Pseudo-intellectuals such as Strauss and Howe play the role that Paul de Lagarde, Julius Langbaum, Arthur Muller, von den Broek, and Alfred Rosenberg played for the Nazi Party. They give an intellectual veneer to racist conspiracy theories, a perverted nationalism, a hatred for culture, and the lust for domination through violence. I share Bannon's distaste for corporate globalization, free trade agreements, the failure to put Wall Street bankers in jail, the bank bailouts and crony capitalism, and would even concede that Americans wallow in the moral swamp of a culture of narcissism. He is right when he attacks the two major political parties as the one party of Davos. But his solution to the purported crisis, total war by the white race to regain its ascendancy, is insane, as are the causes he cites. A New Deal that turned citizens into whining dependents, the permissiveness of the 1960s, white guilt that made the country cater, in his words, irresponsibly to African Americans by giving them social service programs and undeserved mortgages that led to the 2008 financial meltdown. An intellectual and liberal class composed essentially of traitors who hate America, and quote unquote, the new barbarity of jihadists.
That is the incredibly good and much praised address of Chris Hedges in reference to the Trump administration and his intellectual or pseudo-intellectual theorists. We've shown today the refugee crisis and the millions of refugees fleeing from war-torn areas in the Middle East in their effort to find a place where they can live in peace, perhaps with the families, with children. The crisis is ongoing. The critique that we have just heard is a critique that includes Eritrea on the Horn of Africa. Interesting in this case for Eritrea is its positioning. Eritrea is directly on the Red Sea, and a incredibly important area, and one recognizes where the Red Sea narrows here, Yemen, also another country bound by civil war. Eritrea as a totalitarian state from which hundreds of thousands of their citizens are fleeing, and Yemen at the moment gripped in civil war initiated by the United States. Thank you for taking part in today's program. We encourage our viewers to get a look at the New Odyssey by Patrick Kingsley and to watch the full address of Chris Hedges in his ultimate takedown of Donald Trump. Thank you, and hope to see you again next week. Have a good week.